focus on Islam 101. But sometimes we have to delve a little bit deeper and go from Islam 101 to a more advanced Islam. Let's focus on how we may be able to relate to this deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how we as individuals can work to better and strengthen our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So for this, we can look nowhere better than the example of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi wasallam and how he alayhi wasallam interacted with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we know from our teachings that the messengers were sent to us only as examples, that we look towards them to see what they have done and how we can learn from them and better our own lives. So we look ourselves and we ask ourselves this question of when we move forward toward Islam, how can we better our relationship with Allah? How can we work to have a more deeper understanding of Islam? And sometimes we ask this question to individuals who just accepted Islam, or people who are new to Islam, who revert to Islam. We say, what was the thing? What was the thing that brought you closer to Islam? But what we forget is that regardless of how we were brought up or how we were raised, anyone that has a level of dedication to the deen has something in their life that brought them closer to Islam. And sometimes there's a focus on these questions, right? We say, these introspections that we look at. Why do we exist? How did we get here? Where are we going? And these questions kind of make us think about our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And something we forget about is that we must focus on these ideas of Allah. We must focus on the creation of Allah. We must focus on our relationship and how we can understand from it. Right? There's a concept in Islam called tafakkur, which is deep contemplation. And something that, especially in our lives here in America, very fast-paced life, we don't ever have time to think. We wake up as a mad dash, one after another, go to school, go to work, go that, back to bed. But we never have a time to think to ourselves. I believe it was Oprah who said, speaking to her audience, and she was targeting a non-Muslim audience, and she said, take just 30 seconds in the day to think, to contemplate, to go over such introspections in our life. SubhanAllah, this is what Oprah is saying to her non-Muslim audience. What should we be thinking about as Muslims? And we look into the example of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and we realize that this type of introspection was something deep within the life of the Prophet ﷺ, even before he received Nabuwah, before he received his prophethood. For we know the stories of when he received his prophethood, that is the exact thing we are talking about. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would seclude himself from the people. He would go into a mountain, he would contemplate, he would meditate and think about these ideas. What is Allah? What is our relationship with Allah? How can we work to better ourselves and better our understanding and relationship with Him? And when we look at these ideas, we see that these questions were answered directly in the life of the Prophet ﷺ in the first 3 revelations of the Quran that came one after another, and they gave specific examples on how we may interact with Allah. We take these ideas and we call them the Islamic triple threat. If anyone plays basketball, you will understand this idea. When you catch a pass, you have 3 potentialities. If you're a good player, you'll be either to pass the ball, to drive, or to shoot. These are the 3 potentialities that we must have. If you want to be a dynamic player, this is what you have to do. And if you want to be a dynamic prayer, these are the 3 threats that we have to be able to implicate into our lives. So we look at these ideas, and these 3 points are, of course, that of knowledge, of activism, of knowledge, of spirituality, and of activism. These 3 lenses give us an example of how we're able to understand Islam and how we may better to interact with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we look at these ideas, when we realize we must first take a step back and realize when we look at these relationships that we try to analyze Islam through, sometimes we narrow it to too far of a degree. We look at someone and we try to judge a person's religiosity on something a bit superficial. We say, oh, how does this person dress? Or how much Quran does this person know? Or how much charity do they give? Or. We have these ideas that we try to understand Islam through. But we have to understand, to delve deeper, we must have a deeper understanding of Islam. Because when we have these parameters, these things that are so superficial, these things that may not have the same meaning in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it creates a problematic view of our Islam. It will be very detrimental to our communities. So when we look at this, the Prophet ﷺ is being told that the worship of Allah is not one-dimensional. It is not just one thing that we must look at, but it is a variety of different things that we'll implement in our own lives. Yes, we should have good charity, we should have good fasting, we should have good prayer, we should also have good character, we should treat people nice. These different aspects will come together to kind of help us understand this idea of Islam and how we may be able to look into it. Now, if we can return back to the main point, these three ideas, these three concepts that will help us to better understand Islam, help us to better understand, strengthen our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we look at the first one, and this is that of knowledge. And many of us know the story of the first revelation of the Quran, when Angel Jibreel came to the Prophet ﷺ in the cave, and he told him the first word of the Quran, Iqra, told him read. We see here a direct relationship between knowledge and Islam. That before you can do anything else, before we can get deeper into Islam, we must have the knowledge. We must have a basic understanding of Islam. And this is when we come to our ideas of education. Or yes, alhamdulillah, it's good to have a secular degree. It's good to become a doctor, become an engineer, become a lawyer, do what you want. But without our basic understandings of Islam, we will not have a deeper connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or more dangerously, we will get an incorrect education of Islam that will take us far from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So first and foremost, this idea is indicated to us in the first revelation, Iqra, read, go and educate yourselves. And we see this idea narrated to us in the 39th chapter of the Quran, in the 9th verse, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala poses to us a question. He says, are the people that have knowledge, that are educated, are they the same as the ones that do not have education? No. And we see that this is not the same thing, because in the ending part of the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that only the people of understanding are mindful. That if we want to reach this higher level, we must have this education. We must educate ourselves and have a better understanding of how we learn from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the teachings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And an important idea for us to take away from this point of knowledge is to understand the relationship we have as Muslims, as a civilization with knowledge. The point that the barakah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came in such a way that a man, alayhi wassalatu wassalam, who was not lettered, he didn't know how to read nor write, started one of the most educated civilizations in existence. And we see that parallel, that a person that in most dunyawi sense, in most worldly sense, has no education, started a civilization that gave birth to algebra and to chemistry and all these sciences. How do we make this connection? Because on a superficial point of view, it seems ridiculous. It doesn't seem possible. How can this happen? And our scholars comment on this relationship and they say, this is the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because a lot of people don't want to get education in Islam because they're scared. They say, if I learn something, then I'm going to start doing it, and it's impossible, it's too hard for me to do. People will say, it's too hard for me to wake up. We hear this a lot, right? It's impossible for me to wake up for Fajr. It's so hard, I can't do it. And the question is this, what's more impossible? You waking up at 5:30, or a man who could not read or write, starting a civilization that revolutionized education in the world? We see these relationships that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting there for us to think about, to have tafakkur, for us to contemplate and to realize the power and the barakah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we look at this idea of culture, this culture of learning that should be bred within us, that once we learn, that inshallah it will grow amongst us not just knowledge but humility. Because if you are learning, if you are going to study and it breeds arrogance in you, you're doing something wrong. Because true understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should always humble you, should always bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we understand from the first point of this triangle, first point of this Islamic triple thread, these three concepts that we can put into ourselves to make us dynamic Muslims, to make us these active Muslims. The next point for us to look upon is that of spirituality. For once that we have the knowledge, we must begin to have an internal development. We must have tasqiyah, we must have tarbiyah, an internal spiritual upbringing that will help us ground ourselves in this knowledge that we have. And how do we look at this? As we know, the second revelation in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet Muhammad wasalam, Ya ayyuhal muzammil qul layla illa qalilan. He says, O you who's wrapped up, get up in the night and pray for the majority of the night. For we see first after Iqra, first after your reading, first after you gain the knowledge, have your spiritual development. Stand in the night and dedicate it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the point we're talking about here is not specifically about qiyam, but we're talking specifically about spiritual development. But without that spirituality, it would have no benefit for the knowledge that you have gained. And we look at that idea, and there's a famous hadith that is narrated to us when the Prophet Muhammad would get up in the night and he would do these qiyams, these tahajjud prayers. And the very early part of the revelation, his wife Khadija radiallahu anha, she would say, why are you up right now? Why do you, there's still a lot of time left. Why don't you go back to sleep, rest some more, and pray later? And then we see the words of the Prophet ﷺ when he tells us that the time for sleep is over. Meaning what? That now is time for us to work. That if he spends all of his day in the cities, he is doing the Islamic work, he is doing the da'wah, he is calling people toward Islam. What time does he have for his own spiritual development? He spends that in his nights. And we see this reflected to us in the comments of Umar radiallahu anhu when he became Khalifa. He said, I give my days to the people so I can deal with their affairs. He was a leader of the Muslim state at the time. He had to deal with politics and the economy and all these different issues. He was very busy in the day. He said, my nights are for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the development that we talked about. Umar radiallahu anhu, this one probably one of the most learned people in the Muslim Ummah. But he would dedicate his nights towards qiyam. And we see this connection, this relationship that sometimes we as a community we lose. We think that if we gain more knowledge, if I memorize more Quran, if I start giving khatiras, if I start giving khutbah, then I don't have to pray as much. That extra prayer to people that need it. No, as we grow ourselves Islamically, as we grow ourselves with more knowledge, we need more spirituality to keep us grounded. If we don't, then everything we have done would be lost. And then an interesting point that we take to the spiritual development is that in the Quran, in this verse, it tells us what? To be woke in the night, right? To wake up in the night, and that will give us our spiritual development. SubhanAllah, if you understand this idea of being woke, if you don't, you need to go on Instagram. And you understand this idea of how the Quran, subhanAllah, is mirroring what we're seeing today in our own social media, of waking ourselves and understanding how we can better one another. And an important fact to take away is one of my teachers comment to us, and then he told us that if you have this spiritual development, if you have this knowledge without spiritual development, it will lead to corruption. But then you'll have people who are just reading, why? Because they want to find the loopholes. They want to make everything easier. They're like, how late can I actually pray Dhuhr and it's not late? How late can I do this? How can I do that? So without the spiritual grounding, without the internal development, the extra knowledge will actually be detrimental of what we are seeing. And with this corruption, we will see a detrimental part in our own lives. And for us to focus one another, once again, for us to focus for this spiritual development, we must focus first on the fundamentals. We must focus on our own internal development. But of course, we start where? We start with the fara'id. We start with the farz. We start with the very minimal thing, the mandatory things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala requires of us. So first, on this path to spiritual development, after we learned a little bit about Islam, we work on the 5 prayers. If we're not praying the 5 prayers, let us start working on praying those 5 prayers. Start praying them on time. And then if we have not accomplished this, then we don't need to focus too much on all the extra things, because we focus on the fundamentals and we build ourselves from there. Another way for us to understand this concept of development of within is something called interval training. If you go to the gym, if you work out, you understand what this idea is of interval training. Interval training is when you do an exercise and you spend about 15% of the time, you do a very high amount of weight. You do a very strenuous exercise. And the rest of the 80% of the time, you do the same exercise, a little bit of the less weight. And you see the effect that this has. Because the 80% you're spinning it on your base. This is where you're always at. This is how much strength that you have. But that 15% of the time, you're pushing yourself. You're giving yourself more weight. You're giving yourself more strength, more conditioning. And you get to here. And eventually the point is what? Eventually your base will come here. So eventually, as you do interval training, you'll keep raising and raising your level. Because that is how we must develop ourselves. And spiritually, as Ramadan has just ended, we realize that Ramadan is our spiritual interval training. We look at our base. We must have accounting of ourselves. We realize in the other 11 months, how much prayer am I doing? How much salah am I doing? How much Quran am I reading? How much charity am I doing? You find your base mark. And then Ramadan, push yourself. Push yourself. Start praying Al Tarawih the entire night in prayer. You're fasting 30 days. If you give charity only once a week in Ramadan, you give it every day. Maybe you are reading only one verse of Quran a day or less than that, but in Ramadan, work on reading at least one verse a day, one page a day, one juz a day. See what you can do to push yourself. Because once you push yourself, your base will raise. And from that, you'll be able to get the internal development and the internal growth that we are looking for. Because we must realize if you don't push yourself, there won't be any development, right? And if you go to the gym, you realize this. We see the same guy in the same workout place, putting the same amount of weight for weeks on weeks on end. And he gets no gains. His arms are the same size, his back is the same size. Why? Because he is not pushing himself. If you don't push yourself, you will not see the development. You will have to put more plates on, put more weight on to be able to see that growth. And the same thing exists for us spiritually. If we don't push ourselves at some points, and Ramadan is the perfect time for that. If we don't push ourselves, we will not see that development. SubhanAllah, and one of the saddest things that was commented to us is that it would be very sad for a person to go on the day of judgment and you're in front of the angels and you had no development. And the angels are like, bro, did you even lift? Like, what were you doing your whole life? You just stood there and your level stayed the same, you stayed stagnant. But what we realize is you want those gains, you gotta work for it. You have to see the development internally and externally. You start with the knowledge and the spiritual development will come afterwards. And then what we see is an idea of the fluctuations in our faith. Sometimes people get a little scared and they say that, I'm getting really into it, I'm getting really into the deen, and they're in it for a week or two, and then sometimes it goes up and down. For us to realize something is that these fluctuations in our iman, the iman goes up and down is something natural. It's fine, it happens. And this is told to us in a hadith where a sahabi, he went to Umar, he went to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Abu Bakr, he said, I'm a munafiq, I'm a hypocrite. Abu Bakr, what are you talking about? I know you're a great guy. He said, when I'm with you and I'm with the Prophet and the other Sahaba, we're hanging out, my iman is so high, I feel so spiritual. But then when I go home, I get caught up with my issues at home, I get caught up with my business, I get caught up with just the worldly issues, school and work and all that stuff. My iman kind of goes down. And at this point, I read the hadith and I'm like, oh, now Abu Bakr is kind of straight. I'm just going to tell what happened. The next time, I'm like, oh my God, that happens to me too. Let's go find the Prophet. So they were both really worried about their internal state. We talk about this in Sahaba, this stuff, how many they're doing it. They run to the Prophet and they explain to him the situation. They say, when I'm with you, when I'm in the demon, right? When I'm in the spiritual high, my iman is very high. But when I get caught up in the world, I get up in school and work and all this different kind of thing, my iman kind of goes down. The Prophet said that this is a natural process. Our iman will go up and down, it will fluctuate up and down. But what do we take from that? Is that when our iman is down, we don't let that stop us from going back up. That is where we can develop our internal strength. And we must take accounting and we must realize how we can work to raise our iman once it's lowered. Inshallah, we want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make space for us in Jannah, to make space for your brothers and sisters and move forward, inshallah. So what we realize is, to finish the hadith, Prophet Muhammad actually told these two Sahaba, he said that if your iman was the same, when you were not with me, to the same that when you were with me, the angels would come into the streets and shake your hand. SubhanAllah, so we realize that this is something that happens to everyone. This is something that happens to the Sahaba, it's something that happens to the highest levels of Sahaba like Abu Bakr. So we must focus on these internal developments of ourselves and realize that we will not better ourselves unless we have this development. The third point we take away is that of activism or that of action. We went over knowledge, went over spirituality, and the final part is that of activism. How can we implement these ideas in ourselves and work to better one another? And we see this in Surah Al-Mudaththir, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhal mudaththir kum fa'anzir. He said, oh, you who's wrapped up, he says, stand up and go warn the people. Go and do, this is the first time we're seeing actual type of interaction taking place. In the third revelation, go and speak to the people. And this is the command to carry out the message. And the first thing we realize is that after you have the knowledge and you start worshiping, you must share that. You have the knowledge, let us go and do work. Let us go and better the community that we live in. And we realize that, and sometimes we have a very tokenizing view of this betterment, right? The Muslims think, oh, mashallah, look what the Muslims have done. The Sahaba defeated the Romans and defeated the Persians. Yeah, they did that. But The thing to understand is that when this Islam came to the Sahaba, they were able to destroy thousands of years of systemic oppression. They were able to change the fabric of their society for the better. And this is how we must view our task of holding this banner of Islam, right? When we look at these ideas, when we look at Bilal radiallahu anhu, we look at a person, when we start studying the seerah, we start with what? He was a slave. At the end of the seerah, we see a point where he was interim Khalifa at a point after Umar radiallahu anhu. He went from literally being a slave to the ruler of the entire Muslim state. And to think about the time it took for this to happen, a former slave to get the highest office in the land, maybe 40 years, within a lifetime. So there were people who saw Bilal radiallahu anhu as the highest person in the state, who also called him Abid, right? Who called him this disgusting word in Arabic, which pretty much means the N-word. I comment on this because a lot of people that speak Arabic like to use this word thinking it's nice. It's not. It's racist. And don't use that term. And what we realized from that is what? These people saw within one lifetime, saw the change that Islam brings. In one lifetime, they saw a slave going to the highest level of society at that point. To think about that, how long did it take here in America for us to get an African American leader? After all these years of slavery, hundreds and hundreds of years. And this is not a time for us to think that, oh, mashallah, Islam is great. It is great, but how can we implement these kinds of social changes in our own communities? And this is what we look upon. And the point for us to take away is, what can we do to better our own society? How can we implement this activism? When we talk about this idea, let us focus in the second part of the khutbah, practical steps we can take to better ourselves. In the same case of khutbah, make dua for yourself and dua for your community. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم إن الله غفور رحيم. Bismillah. Bismillah. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. No? Bismillah.
This is just a new head. Probably one dead.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Thumma amma ba'd. Inshallah, for us to take these practical steps, and when we talk about this idea of how we can implement this activism in our life, we're not talking about this big esoteric concept, but here in Glendale, what can we do? We know in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, fil ardi khalifa, that He has established us as khulafa, as like guardians in this planet. And we realize, what can we do to implement this and better our communities? We look at this idea, just Ramadan passed, and look at the idea of iftar. After the iftar, you would have how much trash would be left over, how many plates and napkins and cups and oh my God, the water bottles. There were so many water bottles. This is personal to me, because last year, myself and our youth group, we had to clean up all the water bottles. It was a ridiculous amount. But at what point can we say at the masjid, hey, we're gonna have a filling station. We're gonna ask people to bring non-disposable water bottles. So at the point that we can reduce the trash, that we can reduce the amount of impact we're having on the environment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. When we look at this idea, we can also say, when we try, as Muslimin, we say that we worship al-adil, that we worship the most just. But what does this mean when we are looking within our communities and we're seeing ideas of police brutality, of African American men being shot down in the streets? What are we doing to help end this type of systemic oppression that we are seeing? How many times when we see these issues are we saying, let us support, let us join the BLM movement, let us join the Black Lives Matter movement? Or are we saying what? Are we saying, let's just flip the channel when these commercials are coming on? Or how ridiculous are these protests when they block the freeway, right? Do we comment on things like that? Or do we see how we can implement to make a change in the world? For this is the community we are given. We live in Glendale. How can we better and change the world here around us? So for us to understand these ideas, we see that the Prophet ﷺ is told to stand and to give the message, to stand and deliver. And from this, it will reach the people. For us, we should not be disheartened. We should not be disheartened by how big the problem seems. And we should not say there's too many people and it's been around for too long that we can't change anything. Because change is not in our hearts. We will not be asked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what did you do to change? We'll be asked, what did you do? We will see what actions we took place, because victory is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If this oppression will continue, that is by the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when it will end by the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The question is, what are you doing? The question is, if the train is going to reach the station, it will reach the station. But will you be on the train to victory, or will you be off the train to victory? So we must take accounting of ourselves and realize how we can implement this activism in our own lives. And we see a major part of this is when we have this activism of why we should be involved in not just the Muslim community, but the larger community at large. Because we see in a hadith narrated to us where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ makes a distinction. He talks about a person who worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone versus a person who worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the community. And he says the person that worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the community and has to bear the brunt of the people, right? There's different personalities in the masjid, there's different tempers in the masjid. You could face, people could be yelling at you, people could be nice to you, there's all these different kinds of pressures. That person will have more reward. That person will have the reward as if he fasted in the day and prayed in the night. Because the scholars comment on this hadith and they say what? That how can it be that a person who just has their normal ibadah, but in the community is equal to someone who fasts in the day and prays in the night? They said when you pray and you fast, that's between you and Allah. This time when you're within the community, when you're helping to better the community, you're doing it for the sake of Allah. But once again, you're among the people. So there's more to it. And we realize this in Islam, that in Islam we have no monasticism. We have no monks. As internally we work internally in the community to better the community that we see. Inshallah, to work on these ideas, we can better ourselves and become a more dynamic Muslim, to become a better Muslim, to help us inculcate these ideas of knowledge, of spirituality, and activism in our lives, to help us understand the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and implement what the Prophet ﷺ implemented and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to implement. So these are the three pillars of the three concepts that we want to focus on today. And inshallah, we will focus on having all three, not focusing on one and neglecting the other two. Inshallah, because we want to be a holistic and complete worshiper and not just an incomplete worshiper. So in conclusion, we make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ya Rabbil Alameen, we ask you to make us a balanced people. We ask you to give us beneficial knowledge. We ask you to give us spirituality. We ask you to make us activists in your cause. Ya Allah, give us the best in this world and the next. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. أقامت الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر.